Welcome to a new Indonesia Project Global Seminar. My name is Arianto Patunru, and I'm hosting this program with Lydia Napitupulu and Kate McClinton. We acknowledge our respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. We are grateful for the support from the Australian National University and the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Today's webinar is part of our new series on gender equality and social inclusion, or GESI. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Vina Adriany from Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, where she heads the Center for Gender and Childhood Studies. She has background in psychology and education with a PhD from Lancaster University, UK. Today, Vina is going to talk about gender issues in early childhood education in Indonesia. As usual, we will have question and answer session after the talks. But if you want, you can write your questions anytime on the Q&A box, not on the chat box, and we will attend to them in the Q&A session. Please also kindly fill a little polling when it appears on your screen, because we need this to improve our series. So without further ado, let me invite Mbak Vina to start her talk. Silakan Mbak Vina.
Thank you very much, Mas Arianto, and also Lydia and also Kate. Good morning, everyone. It is really an honor for me to be invited by Indonesia Project at Australian National University to discuss what I believe to be an overlooked but an important issue, which is about gender in early childhood education. Now, I would like to share my screen, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, it's coming, yeah? I think everybody can see the screen, yeah. Okay, so again, as mentioned before, today I'm going to share my thought on gender issues in early childhood education with a special reference to Indonesia. And I think I'm very excited, a bit nervous to be honest, to have this discussion this morning, because I think despite of the fact that there has been numbers of research on gender in Indonesia, and also there has been a government attention toward the issues of gender, but when it comes to gender issues in early childhood education, is still very much overlooked. So I would like to briefly introduce the position about early childhood education in Indonesia. Actually, early childhood education in Indonesia plays a very strategic role. If we look at the sustainable development goals, particularly if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals number 4 and number 5, there is a specific reference toward gender issues and also early childhood education. In the Sustainable Development Goals number 4, for example, when we talk about quality education, one of the indicators for quality education that is ensuring the equal access and participation of boys and girls toward high quality early childhood education. So actually, without any doubt, when we are talking about early childhood education, it is, again, as I've mentioned before, a very strategic role in order to achieve a high quality education, and it becomes one of the mandates of the SDGs. And also, if we look at the SDGs number 5, I think obviously it's very clear for us that the emphasis on gender equality is there. And again, when we look at the indicators of gender equality, I think ensuring equal access and participation of boys and girls toward early childhood education is again being mentioned. So what I'm trying to say is that on a global levels, there has been this focus, this emphasis on the gender issues in early childhood education. But as I've mentioned before, when we are talking about early childhood education, however, the dominant discourse very rarely mention about early childhood, about gender issues in early childhood education. And I think there are some reasons, some factors that contribute to the marginalization of gender discussion in early childhood education. I think previous studies by McNaughton indicate that very often when we are talking about early childhood education, we see early childhood education as an innocent space. It is a space of vacuum that will not perpetuate any gender discourses, while in fact, I think a number of research in the past 20 years have also demonstrated the extent to which early childhood education is actually very much gender. And I think it's going back again to, our imaginary concept of early childhood education, of kindergarten. I think one of the most popular songs in Indonesia, I'm not sure if you are familiar, when we are talking about kindergarten, it's always described as a garden full of happiness, full of joy, where children play around. So it seems like it's very difficult for us to imagine that there will be a construction of gender that takes place in early childhood education. And as the result, many teachers adopt what I call as a gender blind attitude. So they always believe that gender is not important, that gender issues is not there, while as I've mentioned before, early childhood education is actually very much gender. And I think the marginalization of gender issues in early childhood education also has to do with the way children are constructed in our society. I think despite of the fact that Indonesian government is fully committed to ratify the United Nations Convention of Children's Rights, but when it comes to society's general understanding of young children, children are very often constructed as an innocent being. They are yet to understand complex issues such as gender. And I think this results in the further silencing of gender issues in early childhood education. And what happened is that because gender is hidden from the discussion about early childhood education, and as the result, as I've mentioned before, teachers adopt a rather gender blind attitude. Teachers very often, they are not aware that they are actually explicitly promoting and in fact reinforcing particular traditional gender discourses related to the binary opposition between masculinity and femininity. And I will talk about this a little bit later on. And many teachers also, they are not aware with the micro power relation that takes place in a classroom setting. So they are not, for example, that some of the teaching would potentially exclude children, and very often children who do not conform to traditional gender behavior is often excluded, penalized even in the kindergarten room setting. So when we are talking about that in early childhood education as mandated Sustainable Development Goal, that it is expected there is an equal access and participation, it's not always the case in early childhood education setting. In kindergarten setting, some children might be potentially excluded because they are not conforming to traditional gender roles for them. So why then the of gender has been silenced from early childhood education? And I think when we are talking about early childhood education, both on a global level and also in Indonesia, there are three dominant forces that shape the discussion and also the practice of early childhood education. I think all over the globe, early childhood education is highly influenced by studies of psychology. My bachelor degree and master degree from psychology, but I'm aware that the discussion of psychology to some extent might potentially exclude the discussion about social issues such as gender, because the emphasis on children's development, the emphasis on children as individual, and it takes away teachers' attention from social issues such as gender. And also if we look at some of the theories in psychology, for example, let's say if we are talking about the theories of moral development from Kohlberg, or theory of sexual development from Sigmund Freud, or other theories of cognitive development, for example, from Jean Piaget, the theories also tend to be gender. For example, in moral development theory from Kohlberg, for example, it is mentioned that boys, they will have a higher reasoning compared to girls. And I think this theory has been so powerful, particularly in Indonesia, and it influenced the way teachers understanding young children. So from the very beginning, there has been this teaching that to some extent is very much gender, and I believe it is also rooted in the developmental psychology discourse. And also early childhood education in Indonesia particularly is also very much shaped by the discourse of biological determinism. There is this understanding that there is an innate differences, unchallenged differences between boys and girls, and I'm going to talk a little bit later and relate this discussion about biological determinism with the discourse of Kodrat, for example, one of the dominant gender discourses in Indonesia. So again, this whole idea that there exists a fundamental differences between boys and girls is also perpetuating gender binary or traditional gender discourses in the classroom. And early childhood education in Indonesia and also all over the globe is very much influenced by the economic perspective. So I think economic perspective on early childhood education is always very, very complicated, because in one sense, using this theory of human capital, for example, the government is pushed to have more attention, to give more attention toward early childhood education. There is this idea, which is obviously we can always problematize later on, but there is this idea derived from Heckman's theory of human capital, that if we invest in early childhood education, it will give a higher return in the future. And to some extent, as I've mentioned before, this economic understanding of early childhood education has allowed to give more attention to early childhood education. But again, as I discussed before, this on economic values of education is also often taking away the discussion about social issues such as gender. So the combination of these three dominant forces in early childhood education, the psychological understanding, the biological understanding, and also the economic understanding, in my view, has contributed to the marginalization of gender issues in early childhood education. And I think when we are about the marginalization of gender issues in early childhood education, I'm going to cite here the quote from Alloway. Here, Alloway mentioned that actually when we are silencing gender issues, to some extent, it also mirrors the neglecting of gender issues in a larger context in the society, and also at the same time, it can also be perceived as a process of silencing young children. And I think it's going back to what I've mentioned before, that when we are talking about how young children are constructed in our society, there is this understanding that children are often constructed as innocent beings. They do not have a voice. They don't understand complex issues such as gender. And I think this again creating further marginalization of gender. So. Now, I just would like to mention that because initially, as I discussed, that when we are perceiving early childhood education, in particular when we are talking about kindergarten, very often we have this imaginary concept of kindergarten. We always imagine kindergarten as an ideal place, a joyful place for young children to get to know each other, to socialize with one another. But what happened is that when we are talking about early childhood education, just like any education setting, it is not a vacuum of space. It is situated in a society, and hence any dominant discourses in a society is also taking place in kindergarten. So when we are talking about gender in kindergarten, I think it is also important for us to understand the dominant gender discourses in Indonesia, and that are hopefully through some of the field note that I have, because most of my studies adopt qualitative research, we can see how these dominant gender discourses are reflected. So that way we can see that kindergarten is not a space, as I've mentioned, but it is a space where political values, ideological values, and also gender values continue to be promoted. Yeah. So I think we have Ibu Parker here, who I'm sure is more expert to talk about these things than me. But if I can share my understanding, I believe that obviously gender discourses in Indonesia is very complex. It's not one singular meaning. But just for the sake of our today's discussion, I think when we are talking about dominant gender discourses in Indonesia, the notion of kodrat is still very much powerful. Kodrat is originally coming from an Arabic word, I think, and somehow is often understood as so I think it is quite similar with the concept of nature, unchallenged nature. While the concept of kodrat initially discussed about the difference between men and women, but in practice, when we are talking about kodrat, the emphasis is always on women. So I think that's why, regardless, yesterday we are celebrating Women's International Days, but I've seen some of the discussion are still sort of like reminding women that, no matter what you do, no matter how high your position, you shouldn't forget your kodrat. And I don't think the same reminder has been given to men. So I think despite the fact that then when we are talking about kodrat, is actually emphasizing the biological differences between men and women. In reality, what we can see is that kodrat regulates women more than it regulates men. Yeah, and again, you can see how the notion of kodrat, it links with the biological determinism. So I think the combination of this sort of like biological understanding and the discourse of kodrat is contributing to the construction of gender discourses in early childhood education setting. And it's also very interesting, despite that, Indonesia, after Reformation, we have achieved so many changes, so many reformation in the society. But I think when it comes to gender issues, the notion of state egoism is very much powerful. I'm sure we all probably know that state egoism is the term coined by Julia Surya Kusuma. So I think it's going back again to the New Order's gender ideology, where a New Order government, in order to preserve its status quo, one of the strategies is that they exclude women from the political activities and they domesticate women through several instruments, such as the marriage law, and then also through the establishment of Dharma Wanita, and then also establishment of PKK, for example. And in this set wisdom, so the main idea, I think what Julia Surya Kusuma is trying to say is that it's a type of motherhood promoted by the government. So it's not so much that I myself am a mother, so it's not so much that I'm against the role of mother, but I think we have to be critical with the version of motherhood which is promoted by the state, and to some extent it also consists an element of power relation in order to preserve the status quo. And I think within state egoism, the domestication of women is very strong. The idea that a good woman, and also it's also very much related with the Japanese value of a good mother, of a good woman. So it's sort of like the combination of the Japanese value, the Islamic understanding, the dominant Islamic understanding of what it means to be a woman, for example, and also the political, the state gender ideology. So there is this version of motherhood of an ideal woman, which a strong emphasis on the domestic roles and also on the mother role. So what I would like to share in the next presentation, is that how actually this intersection in the psychological discourses, biological determination, the notion of kodrat, the concept of state egoism, linked together, and it resulted in the construction of particular gender discourses in the kindergarten. So I just would like to share some of the field notes that I have been doing. My PhD research itself was about gender and power in early childhood education. So some of the field notes that I'm going to show to you is based on my PhD work, and some of them has been published. So later on, if you are interested to read further about this issue, I will be more than happy to share my publication with you. So this is actually taken from one of the kindergarten book. Maybe it is not. This is quite an old book, but it is still there. It is still being used in some of the school. When I did research ago, I've noticed some of the kindergartens, they are still using this book, and we can see here the idea of women, despite of the fact that now women are also participating in the public sphere. But I think what is interesting in this book is that this whole idea about a woman role as a mother, domestic role, is still again emphasized. And also, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the kindergarten setting in Indonesia, but normally when we are talking about kindergarten setting in Indonesia, it is always divided into several areas. So normally in a kindergarten, we will have an art area, and then we will have a dance area, and then we will also have an academic area. It's much depending. It can be different from one kindergarten to another kindergarten. This is what I found in the kindergarten where I did my ethnography at that time. So you can see here in the first picture, this is the picture display in the art area. And we can see here the picture is a girl drawing something. And then there is also another area, which is a dance area. And again, the picture is girls holding a microphone singing. And then there is this academic area, and then the is a boy reading a book. So I think we are all aware that when it comes to semiotic understanding, all picture, all symbol, they can act as a signifier. So what I'm trying what I interpret from this picture is actually how in the kindergarten setting, the space becomes very much gender, the area becomes very much gender. Each areas, they become signifier for femininity and masculinity. So since a very young age, young children, they have been exposed to traditional gender discourses that associate femininity as a female's character. Things like singing, dancing, playing are associated to be girls' activities, and then some activities like academic is associated as boys' activities. And I think this is just one of the examples how kindergarten is not an innocent space. It is a space where traditional gender discourses continue to be promoted and also perpetuated. And this is also some of my field note. I think this is quite an old field note in 2010, but I'm currently at the moment, I'm also doing another research about how young children perceive gender issues in kindergarten. And there has not been many changes, to be honest. This kind of discussion is still taking place on a daily basis. The idea that, teachers, they need to differentiate boys and girls because they believe that there is this fundamental understanding. And as you can see on the last table, how one of the teacher clearly emphasized the notion of kodrat. So she said that, differentiating boys and girls are necessary because it is one of their aim in order to remain the children for their kodrat. So again, when we are talking about access and participation in early childhood education, I myself believe that it's not limited to enrollment. I think very often when we are talking about access and participation to early childhood education as mandated by Sustainable Development Goals, we are limiting our discussion to children's enrollment to early childhood education center. But I think what happened in the classroom on micro level can also illuminate to what extent children are having an equal access and participation. We can see here that if boys and girls, they are differentiated since a very young age, then they actually do not have equal access and participation. In another field note that I have, it's very clear, for example, that some of the plays in the setting are dominated by boys, like outdoor and then block area. Yeah? I'm not sure if you're familiar, but block plays a very important role in early childhood education, while certain areas like indoor is dominated by girls. So there is not equal access and participation to all the space, to all the activities in the kindergarten setting. Yeah? And I also, when we are talking about gender discourses in early childhood education, I think there is also this construction of what Cornell, I think, will as mention it as a construction of hegemonic masculinity. Again, because we used to believe that innocent space, that young children are innocent. So we also think that children's play is innocent. But actually, if to unpack children's playing, it's very complex. It's not just children's playing. A lot of construction taking place there. In one of the field note here, for example, it is obvious that children are playing superhero, one of a very popular playing in kindergarten. For example, it's actually contains some gender construction. So for example, how boys, they are constructed to be a superhero, and girls normally they are constructed to be a civilian, a princess that needs to be rescued by the boys. So as Brown said, very young age, when young children engage in hero play, they are actually exercising a type of hegemonic masculinity. So superhero enable boys to experience specific type of masculine power, and the emotional high that goes with this is also experiencing some sort of power experience. So what I'm trying to say is that there is this construction that also perpetuate the binary between boys and girls, where boys are constructed to have particular type of masculinity and girls are constructed to have a particular type femininity. Yeah. So in the second, I will call it second section of my discussion, I will talk a little bit, because what I discussed just now is happen on the micro level, right, on the classroom setting. But again, in my argument, we need to understand what happens on the macro level, because very often what happens in the micro level might reflect what happens in the society. And also, as I've mentioned before, if we assume that a classroom is an innocent space, we miss a lot of opportunity to use classroom as a strategic place to achieve gender equality. But now I would like to invite you to talk about gender issues in early childhood education on a little bit macro level. Yeah. So what happened is that with the perpetuating of traditional gender discourses in early childhood education, there is this thing what a researcher expert call as feminization of early childhood education. And feminization of early childhood education is not only taking place in Indonesia, it is also happening on a global level. Yeah? So if we look at some of the global discourses regarding the feminization of early childhood education, I think all over the globe, not only in Indonesia, the case is becoming very interesting, because as I've mentioned before, there is this strong discourse on state egoism. There is this heavily emphasis on the notion of kodrat, for example. But even in a global scale, we can see that early childhood education teachers are often seen as an extension of motherhood. So because, and I think later on we will discuss how this perception that situate early childhood education teacher as a job that is associated with female's nature is very problematic, because it leads to so many social justice issues, such as teachers' low wages, for example. But there is this idea that, early childhood education teachers is seen as an extension of motherhood. It's part of their nature. And I think it's becoming very problematic, because it's part of their nature, because then it is not seen as a professional job. I think in Indonesia for the past 10 years, yes, we do have teachers professional program for early childhood education teacher, but I will unpack a little bit later how there remain some issues. Okay, sorry, there has been some issues on my background. Yeah, and also this emphasis on the motherhood role is actually has creating the binary between education and care. I think I'll share later on some of the work that I've done with Compact Team a year ago, how this binary between education and care is also perpetuating to the fact that early childhood education become very much gender. I think early childhood education and also their teacher is often perceived as less competent, less professional, because again, it is seen as part of their nature. It's part of their nature. I think everywhere when we are talking about care work is always associated to have a lower status in the society. And it goes back, I think, to the old binary between the ratio and the emotion, where emotion is seen to be less important than ratio. And when it is translated in early childhood education, we can see how there is this binary between education and care, where education is seen to be something important, and activities that involve a lot of emotion like care is seen to be less important. And I think when we are talking about teaching for young children, obviously, care plays a very dominant role. And again, during the pandemic, it is very obvious that early childhood education is struggling to translate the online learning, because how are we able to translate the notion of care into the online system? I think when other things is quite transferable in the online learning, but the concept of care the notion of care which is needed by young children is very difficult to be translated during the online learning. Yeah? And also the feminization of ECE can also be seen by the less number of male participating as early childhood education teacher. Now, I'm not going to talk about the importance of having male teachers from the role models theory, because I think role model theory is very problematic, but I myself see the existence of male teachers in early childhood education has some potential to deliver gender flexible pedagogy. So young children, since a very young age, they will be exposed to role which is not associated with traditional gender roles. Like, for example, when teaching, it's normally associated with female, then by having male teacher, young children might be exposed to understand that actually caring job can also be done by any gender. But again, because of there is this understanding that ECE teacher is an extension of motherhood, so prevent disability males from participating as teachers in early childhood education. But I would like to feminization of early childhood education in Indonesia with the expansion of early childhood education. I think it's important for us to understand the relationship between the two. Obviously, the relationship is not straightforward. The relationship is not linear. It's very complex. But I think it's also important for us to understand. Again, as I've mentioned before, the feminization of early childhood education takes place all over the globe, but I think there is something quite particular, quite unique about Indonesia. So Indonesia itself, since 2001, there has been a global push for early childhood education in Indonesia. I think it started with the Education for All initiative, followed by the Millennium Development Goals, and nowadays we have Sustainable Development Goals. And all this global agenda, they have an emphasis toward high quality early childhood education. So I think starting in 2001, Indonesian government, they established a special directorate within Ministry of Education and Culture that is responsible for early childhood education. But despite the global push, the government's attention to early childhood education, the ECE's budget in Indonesia remains very low. So compared to the country's educational budget, which is 20%, the budget for early childhood education is only 2%. And as the result, 98% of early childhood education in Indonesia is run by private and individual volunteerism. And we will see how then this leads to gender issues, because most of the early childhood education is run by either private and individual volunteerism. So obviously, the quality and also the service of early childhood education is very much depending on the financial capital of each center. The center who has sufficient financial capital, they can run a high quality early childhood education center. But the center who do not possess adequate financial capital, they will obviously they will just establish accessible early childhood education. And the fact that early childhood education in Indonesia is run by private volunteerism has also led to the dichotomy between formal and non-formal early childhood education setting. Now, the discussion about formal and non-formal education, early childhood education in Indonesia is a very complex discussion. But I think if I can simplify for today's discussion, when we are talking about formal early childhood education, it's normally more regulated. There is this regulation, the formal early
recording in progress.
The formal early childhood education, they have certain regulation. For example, if one would like to become a teacher in formal early childhood education center, they need to be at least graduated from University Department of Early Childhood Education. And later on, they will be entitled for teachers training program, teachers professional development. And if they pass this teacher professional development, will allow them to have the additional incentive as a teacher. But for non-formal early education center, because it is run by volunteerism, it is normally established in the village by PKK, by housewife, for example, who do not have a formal education. It is not regulated. But because it is not regulated, they also do not have access to teachers professional program. And as the result, they also do not have access to get additional income. So we see also another form of inequity between teachers who are teaching in formal early childhood education setting and teachers who are teaching in non-formal early childhood education setting. The research done by Newberry, for example, indicate how there are many teachers who are teaching in non-formal early childhood education, teacher who are not getting a proper payment, for example. Some of them even only paid by vegetables if it is in the village. Some of them receive the salary less than 100,000 rupiah per month. And again, because most of the teachers in early childhood education is female, then obviously it becomes gender issues. Now, the non-formal early childhood education setting is normally mobilized by housewife and also PKK's member. And again, they're doing it because of their understanding that this is part of their motherhood duty, that is part of their responsibility as a mother to take care, to educate young children, and as being properly paid. So the expansion of early childhood education in Indonesia, what I'm trying to say, is very much relying on the female's labor, especially in the village, because again, as I've mentioned before, there is this discrepancy between the formal early childhood education setting and the non-formal early childhood education setting. So as the result, we see the realities where early childhood education teachers, female, particularly those who are teaching in non-formal setting, are not being properly paid. There is this I think it's kind of an expression among the teachers who teach in early childhood education setting, the non-formal setting, that the teacher's salary is sajuta. Sajuta stand for sabar, jujur, and tawakal. Meaning that if you would like to become a teacher in kindergarten setting, in the non-formal setting especially, you have to be ready not to be paid, but your payment will be in heaven. Your payment will be sabar, which is patient, jujur, honesty, and tawakal, piety. So this discourse is very strong, promoted among the teachers. And again, I think gender issues plays a very dominant role here, because many teachers, it is through their understanding as a mother, it is through their understanding as a woman, that they believe that they have to participate in educating young children. They normalize the fact that they don't receive a proper payment for their profession. Again, even though the situation is perhaps quite similar with any other country, because based on my reading to the literature, for example, it is also suggested that early childhood education teachers in another country, they're also having a low status, a low salary. But what I would like to emphasize in today's discussion is that how this condition where teachers, women, not getting proper paid in early childhood education setting is also the result of the expansion of early childhood education setting, as I've discussed before. Yeah? So this is the quote from Newberry in 2012, where Newberry said that how the growth of early childhood education is always relying on the women's voluntarily. Women are asked to deliver social welfare. Women are asked to participate to establish early childhood education program in their village. But again, because it is run on the voluntarism, they are not getting a proper payment, or they are not getting a proper salary. So this situation, I think it creates a lot of issues. Yeah, I think it's very interesting that when we are talking about early childhood education, the narrative is always that it's good for the children's interest. But I think sometimes you have to be critical, as does children's interest is always situated as an opposition of women's interests, because we have to educate young children. We see young children as a future generation, but do we have to do that at the same time exploiting women's labor, for example? And I think there has been some question. Newberry in her publication, and also Yulida Pangastuti in her thesis, is also discussing to what extent this expansion of early childhood education is conducted at the expense of women's labor. And again, I think it raises the question, do women and children in a binary opposition where their interests cannot meet with one another, that you can only have one interest at the expense of another's interests. Yeah, and this situation of the fact that women are being they become sort of like a victim of this whole expansion of early childhood is very much is also very is also very obvious during the COVID-19. In the research conducted by the Compact team, where I was also participating and as one of the researchers there. We did research about the effect of COVID-19 to early childhood education, and our research suggests female teachers, they are suffering from layers of marginalization during COVID-19. Their position as female, for example, because in our society in Indonesia, female is often perceived not as the main breadwinner, so their positions become invisible. So it's very interesting, for example, when there is this social money during the COVID, and despite the fact that these early childhood education teachers, some of them, they have to lose their job because many early childhood education settings are shut down during the pandemic. And again, it goes back to this distinction between education and care, because early childhood education is seen to not delivering a proper education program. And many of the programs are conducted with the parents at home. So parents who are also struggling financially often reluctant to send their children to early childhood education center during the pandemic, because there is this whole idea, why should I pay if I'm the one who have to teach my children? So a lot of early childhood education center in the village, they have to close down during the pandemic. Obviously, many women, they lose their job, but they are not entitled to receive the social money, for example, during the COVID-19, because their position not as the main breadwinner. So a lot of layer of marginalization is taking place during the COVID-19 for female in early childhood education setting. But again, it is not obvious because many of us, when we are seeing early childhood education, we don't use our gender lens. So I hope today's discussion is just an invitation. A lot of things needs to be unpacked actually. So I hope my presentation is not that confusing, particularly when I talk about different system of early childhood education setting. But I hope it can to some extent illuminate the extent to which early childhood education in Indonesia is very much gender, both on the teaching practices level and also on the macro level when we are talking about feminization of early childhood education. So I think perhaps that's it, and I would love to hear any comments, any question, probably any discussion that we can have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mbak Vina, for a very interesting and insightful talk with very rich materials. I see it has invited some reactions. I haven't seen any hands raised, but there are some questions in the Q&A. Maybe I can ask if these friends want to ask their questions directly. I'll start with Ross. Ross McLeod. Ross, do you want to correctly? Can we unmute Ross, Lydia? Silakan, Ross.
Okay, thank you. I just had jotted down a number of questions as you were going through your presentation. Thank you very much for the presentation, by the way. So they're a little bit random, so I can just read them out. There was one diagram there that purported to show rates of return from investment in education at different levels, and it didn't have any numbers on it. So I wondered if that is an empirically based diagram or just something that came out of somebody's. I'd really be surprised if that were literally true, frankly. Secondly, you had a photo from one of the kindergartens I think you were looking at, and there were three different centras. One was art, one was music, and one was persiapan for further education or something like that. And it wasn't clear to me whether boys participated in all three of those, or boys and girls participated in all three, or did they segregate themselves, or did their teachers segregate them? So I'd just like some clarification of that. And then you gave an example of a teacher who gave boys and girls different hats because they were boys and because they were girls. And that to me is the, maybe I've got my terminology wrong, but to me that's the antithesis of gender blind teaching. It's gendered teaching in the sense of, you know, I'll treat boys this way and I'll treat girls that way. So maybe I just don't understand the nuances of the terminology, but perhaps because you started out by saying that the kindergarten teaching was gender blind, so I don't understand that. And the final question is my economics question. You seem to be saying that male teachers receive higher wages than female teachers at the kindergarten level. If that is true, then my question is, well, why would any private sector kindergarten employ male teachers? Because they're going to be more expensive than females, and that would necessarily reduce the profit of the kindergarten, and that's not their objective. So perhaps you could tell me a little bit about that aspect too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Ros. Silakan, Mbak Vina.
Thank you, Ross, for the question. I hope I can respond to all your question. I think can I just start with the latest one, the one that
Sure.
I'm sorry if it wasn't clear, but actually I did not mention that male teachers, they will receive a higher salary. In fact, because teachers in early childhood education setting, they often have a poor salary. This also become an obstacle for male to participate as teachers in early childhood education setting. It's probably you know that in Indonesia, men is often expected to become the main breadwinner. So by becoming a teacher in early childhood education, it's seen as an obstacle to fulfill that role. Obviously, we are talking about traditional gender construction. So actually, this is one of the reasons why men are reluctant to become a teachers in early childhood education setting. But I have to mention that I think the research done by Yulindra Sari is also demonstrating that despite the low number of participation of male in early education setting, but once they become part of early childhood education setting, they often occupy a leadership role. So they are selected to become the principal simply because they are. And again, it's going back to the whole gender discourse that situate men as a leader. Yeah. So in another country, I have to say yes, like I think in the UK and also in Sweden, there has been some incentive from the government to give more incentive to give more salary to if they are willing to participate as a teacher in early childhood education setting. But I don't think we have that policy in Indonesia. I myself see that if we increase the salary of men is also very problematic, because I think again there is this whole embodied idea that when it is done by male, it is more value than when it is done by female. So for me, it's very problematic. As I've mentioned, I myself see the participation of men in early childhood education setting not so much grounded on the role model theory that, because this is also a very strong discourse that young boy, they need to be introduced to a male figure. We have to go beyond that discussion. I see male participation in early childhood education as a possibility to deliver gender flexible pedagogy, because we are teaching young children that caring work is not always associated with female or with women. So that's your last question. Yeah, and also about the graphic. Yeah, I think it's a very valid point that you are mentioning, Rose, that whether it's true that investment in early childhood education can bring higher return in the future, but that is one of the very powerful discourses that have been used in almost government's program. And I think it's also used in many countries like China. But I think as we can see in Indonesia, there is this contradiction, because in one side, there is this understanding that early childhood education is a form of investment, but when it comes to the budget, as I've mentioned before, the budget for early childhood education remains very low compared to other level of education. For example, in China, the discourse about human capital, for example, has allowed the government to fully participate in making sure that they establish accessible early childhood education for children in the rural and urban area. In Indonesia, it's also pushing the government to establish many early childhood education center. But as I've mentioned in my discussion, very often the establishment of early childhood education setting is done through people's voluntarism. So it's not the government's budget. I think if we look at the budget of early childhood education, we can see, despite the rhetoric that it is a form of investment, but still it's not becoming the government's priority, despite the fact that it has been mandated by the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, and also about the field note that I show in my presentation, I think precisely that's what I would like to argue, that teachers, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to show some of the data, some of the interview that I have with the teacher, where they insist they do not differentiate boys and girls. But what we can see, in fact, their teachings are very much gender. But when we ask further why they are doing that, this is where the discourse of Kodrat will come in handy, because they will say, oh, we are not differentiating boys and girls. We are just trying to remind them about their Kodrat. And I think in Indonesia, where religion values, particularly Islamic values, is very important, the concept of Kodrat is becoming very powerful. But teachers, they always feel that they do not differentiate boys and girls. Well, in fact, as we can see throughout their teaching is actually very much gender. And it's also very much interesting because, and again, I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to show it in my presentation, but if you are interested, I can share with you my publication on it. Because I've mentioned earlier that one of the dominant forces in early childhood education is this developmental psychology. And within this developmental psychology, there is this whole idea about child-centeredness, that in early childhood education setting, you need to put children at the center. And sometimes it becomes a reason for teachers to sort of like, give up their responsibility. So whenever we see young boys and girls, they are participating in traditional gender discourses, the teacher always say that this is not what we want, this is what the children want. And because of this child-centeredness, I should not interfere. I think if we read studies conducted by McNaughton and also by other feminist post-structuralists, they will actually suggest that as a teacher, you need to be aware with power relation that happens in the classroom. So you need to be able to interfere where you see that particular play of children potentially exclude girls or potentially exclude non-conforming gender behavior from another child, then this is where teachers need to interfere. But very often teacher refuse to interfere because they said, oh, this is what the children want. While we know that also children is not also an innocent being, they pick up this behavior because this is what they're always taught since they were little. And again, my apologies for not being able to show the data. Actually, when I demonstrate the different areas available in the kindergarten, it's also affecting unequal access and participation. So. Yes, you are right that boys, they are participating more in academic areas, in the preparation areas. Girls, they spend more time playing with in the art center or in the tree house, for example. Boys also, they are having more access to our. And you can see it's actually sometimes it's also resulted in the form of bullying, where some children, they are being excluded because they are not part of the group. So it's very interesting micropolitics that takes place on a kindergarten level, actually, if we are adopting our gender lens in trying to understand the children's behavior. I hope I'm responding to your question, Ros, and again, thanks for the question.
Thank you, Mbak Vina. Let me read a question from Angie Bexley. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. You explained the micro-level gender representations and the macro international feminizations, but could speak more to the national level, particularly the influence of the conservative push at the national level in policy to enforce gender norms, Kodrat, etc., on the ECEC sector.
Yeah, from
Angie. Yeah.
Sorry, Angie. Yeah, thank you for the question, Angie. Yeah, it's interesting actually if we look at the national program in order to push early childhood education. I believe some of the programs are very much gender. I'm not taking away the government's effort in order to expand early childhood education center. But again, I think it's sometimes very important for us to also be critical of all the programs that have been conducted by the government. One of the program adopted by the government, for example, to expand early childhood education program through the program called Bunda PAUD. Bunda is a word, is translated as mother. Yeah? So Bunda PAUD is normally a position. It's a given position for the wife, the governor, the wife of the mayor of the city, and also the wife of a head of a village. So I think, again, we can see how very generous it is, because you are simply given that position because you are a wife of a certain government official. And so again, the term Bunda PAUD itself, and also with the role associated to it, I think it's again perpetuating the idea that early childhood education profession is an extension of motherhood. This Bunda PAUD is mobilized to again mobilize another woman. So using women, they are mobilizing another to participate to establish early childhood education center. But little discussion has taken place about what happened with the teachers' welfare. And again, I think in Indonesia, there has been a number of research in trying to unpack the kind of voluntarism that takes place in Indonesian village. And it's always very interesting because I think there is this power play. Yes, this is pushed by the nation. This is pushed as part of the state gender ideology, but also there is this cultural understanding, religious understanding that allow people to celebrate this power, to participate in power. So I think this is what sometimes is difficult to understand, why this woman voluntarily established early childhood education without getting a proper payment. And I think this is just demonstrating how power travels not through repressive forces, but it's a true discourse. And in my argument, this is through the discourse of Kodrat, that women, they are normalizing the fact that they are mother and they have to participate in educating young children, even though it is resulted in the low wages, sometimes not being paid at all. And I hope I'm responding to your question, Angie. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Vina. Next, let me invite first Terry Hall. Terry, are you there? Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Fine.
Okay, good. Sorry, I had to find the unmute. Thank you very much. Interesting presentation. I wondered about the early childhood education, because that's a time of transition from the parent to another adult in the child's life. And I've wondered how that works in different cultural settings. Indonesia, according to, has hundreds of ethnic groups. And as you cross ethnic groups, there's lots of discussion of matrilocal, matrifocal, other kinds of societies. And the picture you have been giving is of binaries, of masculine and feminine, and also binaries of parents and children. But is it that it's binaries, or are there hundreds of different forms of gender roles that are taught to children across the different ethnic groups? Or is all of that being swept away by the national project of Indonesian nationalism? Thank you.
Thanks, Pateri.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very important question. I think I have to make a disclaimer here that research about gender in early childhood education in Indonesia is still very much limited. I think for the past 10 years, there has been an increasing interest to do research on this area. But I think in general, the discussion is still very much limited. And I have to say that the discussion is still very much focusing on the kindergarten setting in Java. There has been research conducted by Yulida Pangastuti, for example, in Kupang. And I think though her research is not specifically about gender, but I think in her research, she argues that I think it's very important, Pateri, when you are relating with the whole idea about nationalism, because I think we are all aware that Javanese is a dominant values, is a dominant culture in Indonesia. So when it travels to another education setting outside Java, I think the gender construction is also linked together with this Javanese as a hegemonic, as a dominant values, because I think in her research, for example, Yulida Pangastuti mentioned how female teachers in Kupang, yes, they are also mobilized through voluntarism, but another element which is interesting, and I don't think I find it with my participant, is that because they want to dress as ibu, and in Kupang, you don't normally address female teacher as ibu, right? It's mama. Normally you call them. So there is this idea that ibu is more honor. It has more social status because when you went to market, for example, in Kupang, and then there is a female seller, for example, you normally call them mama, and you call everybody mama. So when they become a teacher, people will call ibu, and for them it is a kind of the. There is a social mobility. Their status is become elevated. We know that in terms of salary, it remains very low. So I think there is also this element of, so when in a research conducted by Pangastuti in outside Java, I think there is also this combination between the gender construction, the dominant gender discourse, and also the dominant values of Java links together. It creates particular gender construction, but it doesn't take away the fact that women are still being exploited in order to become a teacher. But I've seen your comment as an invitation. I think it is important to conduct research on outside Java to understand more about gender construction. And I think you are very right that despite the fact that Indonesia is very rich, and also I think when we look at the indigenous culture in Indonesia, they have more than 2 binary categories for gender. But again, when it comes to gender discussion in the classroom, the binary is often between men and female. And I think that's something that probably I myself needs to explore more. So thank you, Terry, for the question and also the insight for further research in the field.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Terry and Vina. Next, let me read another question from Buhoria. She was wondering what you mean by ECECE as innocent place, as opposed to another discourse that says that ECECE is a space for political contestation, in the sense that everyday politics, not government politics. And then she also asks about your field work, related to your field work. And she was asking, what do you think if you see 3 pictures, one with a girl drawing, another one with a girl dancing, and the third one is a boy reading a book. Do you think those pictures, or those who created these pictures, consciously wanted to send a message about gender-specific tasks or expressions? Or do you think that was done not in purpose to show some gender issue? Maybe it is drawn out of spontaneity.
Okay, thank you very much, Buhoria, for the question. I think when I said that early childhood education setting is often perceived as an innocent space. It's not that I believe it is an innocent space. Obviously, my presentation is sort of like trying to challenge that notion that ECE is an innocent space. In my presentation, I'm trying to show the extent to which ECE is actually very much political, it's very much gender. But I think what I'm trying to say is that there's this perception that situate early childhood education, vacuum of space, unconnected with what happened in the larger socio-political discourses. As a result, we don't pay much attention to it. So I think my presentation is like trying to show the political elements of early childhood education and how it is important for us to have more discussion about what happened in early childhood education. In my discussion, I try to adopt a gender lens in order to understand how a gender is promoted, traditional gender discourses is promoted in early childhood education setting. And about whether regarding the three pictures that I show earlier in my presentation, I think this is where I argue that it adopts a gender blind attitude because when I interview the teachers, they don't have, at least this is what they claim, they don't have any intention to differentiate boys and girls. But again, when you look at the space in kindergarten, the areas in kindergarten, the teaching, the book, everything is very much gender. Yeah. So I think this is why I mentioned that teachers adopt gender blind attitude. Very often they are not aware that they are very gender, and even though when they realize that they are very gender, sometimes they will justify using the religious discourse, using the psychological discourse, and sometimes, as I've mentioned earlier, using the notion of child-centeredness in order to argue that, you know, this is not something that we want, but this is what is happening. And I think this is why it is important to have this discussion about gender issues to help together with the teachers, deconstruct their gender understanding, to make them aware, to make them reflective with teaching practices, and then to realize to what extent their teaching is very much gender. Because I believe one of the road in order to achieve gender equity is that by allowing people to be reflective with their own gender practices, and by allowing them to be reflective with gender practices, then they are slowly able to deconstruct their own gender understanding.
Thanks, Vina. Next, can I invite Kylie Stevenson?
Okay, thanks very much. Sorry, me too. I had trouble finding my unmute. Thanks so much, Vina, for a fantastic presentation. It's really informative and insightful. My question was about the professionalisation of early childhood teaching. So in the Australian context, it's become a university-based process where early childhood teachers get a 4-year teaching qualification. I'm wondering about that situation in Indonesia, if that same situation exists, and if so, what education about gender roles occurs in the training and education of early childhood teachers. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kelly, for your question. In Indonesia, when it comes to teachers' professional program, there are two streams actually: the pre-service teacher, which is conducted in a university and part of the bachelor degree. As I've mentioned before, if you would like to become a teacher in formal kindergarten, then it is required, it is compulsory for you to have a bachelor degree in early childhood education or inside. And then there is also another layer of teachers professional program, which is the teacher professional development. This program will be done once you become a teacher. So the first one is the pre-service training. It's to prepare the future teacher. And then another one is the training that takes place once you become a teacher. But, and I think as I've mentioned before, this is where actually one of the problems pertaining gender arise. Because as I've discussed earlier in Indonesia, and I know it's very confusing for those of you who are not familiar with early childhood education setting in Indonesia, but early childhood education in Indonesia is marked by the distinction between formal kindergarten and non-formal kindergarten. Now, the distinction between the two is not straightforward. Sometimes it's difficult to identify the distinction. But I think one of the easiest category that I can give, most of the non-formal kindergarten is run by people's voluntarism. And when it is run by people's voluntarism, they are given more flexibility to establish early childhood education setting. And one of the flexibility is that the teacher does not have to be graduate from university, because non-formal early childhood education setting, normally it is established in the village with limited resources, so there is no requirement for teachers to be graduated from university. But because the teacher is not graduated from the university, they do not have access to the teacher's professional development program. And the teacher's professional development program in Indonesia is not only related with your professional development as a teacher, but it's also related with some economic incentive. If you have undergone the teacher's professional development program and you are passing the program, then you will be entitled to have additional salary. We call it as a teacher certificate program. But since teachers in non-formal setting, they cannot access the teacher's professional development program, obviously they do not have access for this additional salary as well. And this is where inequity comes between teachers in the formal setting and teachers in the non-formal setting. And because most of the formal kindergarten is situated in the urban area, while in the city, while the non-formal kindergarten is situated in the village, sometimes it's also highlighting the inequity between early childhood education setting in the city and also in the village. This is a little bit complex, Kyla, but I hope you can grasp what I'm saying. And again, going back to your question, whether there is some gender training given to the teacher, and I think this is why excited to have discussion. Yeah, I think if I'm not mistaken, in the chat room, Ross asked about, am I trying to override all the program? No, I'm not trying to throw the baby out of the bathwater. Yeah, so my suggestion is not to completely throw away all the program that has been conducted by the government. But I think we have to admit that when it comes to gender, it has little attention, but as we can see that the gender issues in early childhood education is not only affecting the teaching practices, but also it's also affecting the teachers' welfare, and also it's affecting the social inequality. So I think what I'm hoping to have with the discussion about gender issues in early childhood education is that for the government probably, and also for the teachers training institute, to start insert the gender subject in the teachers training curriculum, so that teachers, when they are graduated, they will have this gender lens that will allow them to be more reflective with their teaching practices, and making sure that their teaching practices is not perpetuating the binary between men and women, and also not perpetuating traditional gender discourses. So I hope it's responding to your question, Carol. Thanks again.
Thank you, Vina and Kylie. Audience interest, the last part was in response to Rose McLeod's question, asking about a takeaway message from this presentation. Okay, let me ask on Lina cannot ask directly, so let me read her question. There is another question from Lina Lumban Raja. I don't know whether you also did research in the private ECEC, but I wonder whether the private ECEC also experienced this same issue, the gender ECEC setting, because the curriculum of the private ECEC is somehow innovative. For example, the Montessori method. So can you comment on this? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Lina. Actually, the field notes that I did was conducted in a private kindergarten in Bandung. The private kindergarten is not so much a high-profile kindergarten, meaning it's not that expensive, but it does aim toward children from middle-class family. And the kindergarten also adopt what we call as BCCT, Beyond Center and Circle Time. It is a particular educational method for kindergarten developed in the state, and then it is being adopted by that kindergarten. And also I've done a couple of research about teachers' teaching in teachers' experiences, teaching in private and also international kindergarten. And I think based on my research, I can confirm that gender issues also take place in private settings. And again, I think it's going back to this strong, pervasive, dominant gender discourse in a society. And it's also very interesting because when I did research in international kindergarten, beside the element of gender, there is also another layers, for example, where teacher is being discriminated not only because of their gender, but also nationality. There are layers of discrimination and marginalization. Obviously, the experience of teachers in private kindergarten will not with the experience of teachers in a public low-profile kindergarten, as I mentioned, but definitely gender issues are still there. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Oh, there is one just come in from Dewi Ulya. Dewi, would you like to ask directly? Dewi, are you there? If not, I'll just read it again. So our question from Dewi Ulya, it's very insightful, Vina. I'm interested in doing PKM about gender. What kind of program in PKM to arise the gender awareness among teachers in kindergarten besides the socialization?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think probably I think PKM is a community service program. Normally, every university, they have this community service program. I've actually, 3 years ago, with colleagues of mine, Dr. Hani Yulindrasali and also Dr. Safrina Norman, we did this small action research trying to deliver a gender flexible pedagogy. And I think in any feminist action research that one adopts, I think reflexivity becomes a key. And for us, when we are developing any program, the program is not conducted as a top-down approach. I think we need to allow the teachers to, and I've published actually this project action research project about developing gender flexible pedagogy. Maybe they will later on, if you would like to read it, I'm more than happy to share the publication with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vina. Let's see, any other question? I see Bu Lynn Parker is in the audience. Lynn, would you like to comment or share your insight?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Good.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Vina. That was so interesting, and it's lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you too. Thank you.
I really enjoy hearing some snippets from your fieldwork. I feel like a lot of the writing about education in Indonesia is very much dominated by the human capital discourse, and maybe it's mostly been written by economists rather than people who are spending time in classrooms and kindergartens. So it was really fresh to hear that sort of thing. I think what I struggle with all the time is, while there's even now policy on gender mainstreaming in Indonesia, and it's supposed to be happening at all levels of schooling, to me, the difference between sex and gender is not understood. So, you mentioned many times about gender being a social construct. And I think Angie's question was also getting to this, that the discourse now of this very socially conservative discourse about the quadrat, the gender quadrat, is it's very hard to argue against it. It's very hard to say, well, women aren't naturally nurturing and caring, for instance. So I don't know I don't quite know what to do about it. I don't know how we can best address this problem, both in early childhood education, but more generally in Indonesian society.
Yeah, thanks, Ibu, and it's lovely to hear you again after so many years. So, yeah, I agree with you, Ibu. Definitely, it has been a very challenging process. I think even, for example, as a feminist myself, even for me, sex itself is a construct, right? Because through the medical intervention, one can always undo his or her sex, their sex, for example. But when I'm, for example, working with the teachers, like the action research project I did with Hani and also with Sabrina, sometimes we really have to take everything slowly, one step at a time. So, for example, we start by trying to undo their understanding about sex and gender. I think for teachers in Indonesian setting, and also Indonesia, as you mentioned, for the past 10 years, we've seen this strong resistance toward feminism, for example. So I really, when I did this project with my colleagues, we really take it slow. We really try to make sure that we are listening, we are trying to understand the complexity of their experiences. And one of the strategies we are trying to do is that by going very basic, by explaining the difference between sex and gender. But also another powerful thing that is happening during the Action Research Project is that because we've done so much reflexivity, so there is this huge room for reflexivity. We invite the teachers to unpack their experiences as a mother, as a teacher, as a wife, for example, as a woman in the society. And this allows them to understanding that yes, gender issues is real, and yes, at some point in their life, they're also being discriminated because of their identity as a female, and also they start to realize this injustice they're experiencing as female teachers in early childhood education. And once they achieve this understanding, they slowly are opening up and willing together to deliver this gender flexible pedagogy. And for me, that was a very powerful. We conducted that action research project for the past 3 years. Obviously, it cannot be generalized, but because it is a small scale research qualitatively. But I think nevertheless, it shows the possibility to disrupt traditional gender discourses in early childhood education setting. But I agree with you, Professor Lin, that a lot of patience is required, I have to say. It's very challenging and it can also be very frustrating. But we decided to do that action research because at the same time, we felt that despite the fact that there has been a number of research about gender in early childhood education, but little changes have taken place in the society. So I think maybe we need to do something more practical, which is doing the work together with the teacher. And it has been very powerful, very, very insightful experience. Right, it's quite challenging, but I think when we manage to do it, it's worth it. It's worth the experience. It's worth the challenge, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Vina and Bulin. I think we have time for one more question. I see another question from Ross. Ross, do you mind asking it directly?
Yeah. Okay. You can hear me? All right. I've written it down because I'll forget it otherwise. But I'm trying to summarize in my own mind, Vina, what it is you've been telling us. And it seems to me that your basic concern is that even though the teachers in the kindergartens that you've looked at, they personally think that they treat boys and girls the same. In reality, you observe that the things that they do reflect and reinforce and perpetuate what are actually widespread societal norms as to what boys and girls should do and how they should behave, respectively. Now, you and I probably think that's a bad thing. I personally think that all children should be treated as human beings and forget the fact that boys or girls, and that they should aspire to do whatever they want to do in their lives. But as you're arguing, the way a lot of the teachers are sort of unconsciously, subconsciously treating the kids under their care, they're perpetuating these existing societal norms. it seems to me that everything that's happening in these kindergartens just reflects what most people in society want to happen. You know, the parents are sending their kids to these kindergartens. They know what they're like. They know what they're getting. And you and I might like to see a different kind of education for kids. But I think it's necessary to acknowledge that the problem is not the kindergartens. The problem is the societal norms that people have grown up with. And those things, however much you and I might want them to change, they're not going to change just because we say so. And we need to be a little bit careful about being ivory tower academics who are telling the rest of the world how they should live their lives and what the world should be like. So you might comment on that, but that's just my thoughts that I'm trying to pull together what I learned from the presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, for the comment and the question. I think precisely my aim is not to blame the teachers, especially if we look at the teachers, they are situated in particular discourses, and you are very much right that when we talk about what happened in the classroom is actually a reflection of what happened in the larger society. So, and I think this is what the whole presentation is all about. I'm trying to invite you all to see that, you know, kindergarten is not an innocent space. It's not a vacuum of space. A lot of values, political values, ideological values, gender ideologies are flying freely in the kindergarten, and because sometimes we are not aware of that, we don't pay much attention. Now, obviously, because most of the research that I adopted, that I did adopt qualitative research, for example, like what I've mentioned earlier, you know, in order for this gender flexible pedagogy, I did the small action research program. And I think it's very important that even if we would like to invite the teachers to conduct the changes, they have to be aware, they have to be reflective, they have to realize that their teaching is very much gender. And it's not I don't think it's appropriate for me to go to the field and tell them that they are wrong. So what I did is that I did a lot of documentation, I did video recording, and I shared the video recording with the teachers. And it's very powerful experience actually when I did this action research with the teachers, because the teachers, when they were given this video documentation of their teaching, only then they realized, oh yeah, I did actually differentiate the children. I've never been aware of this part. And then again, as I've mentioned before, we also invite them in a reflective session, you know, try to talk about their experiences of being a woman, being a wife, being a teacher, and to what extent they have been because of that identities. And again, this open up their understanding that gender issues is very much real. I understand it is a qualitative research conducted in 1 or 2, 3 kindergartens, so obviously it cannot be generalized. But I would like to be a little bit more optimistic. I think still it demonstrates the possibility to disrupt traditional gender discourses. And as I've mentioned earlier to Kel, I think it's also important that the curriculum in a university for preparing kindergarten teachers also include the gender subject, so that when teachers are graduated, they have this gender lens to understand not only what happened in the classroom, but also I think to understand their position and to have to demand what is right for them, and not seeing their profession as simply as an extension of a motherhood role. So a lot of things to be answered, Ross, but I hope at the moment that's what I can respond to your question. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mbak.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Mbak Vina. With that, our time is up. I'd like to thank everyone, all the attendants, participants, but of course, most importantly to the speaker, Mbak Vina. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I'll turn this back to Lydia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And also, of course, thank you, Mbak Vina, for very insightful presentation. Before I close, I'd like to invite those of you in Canberra to attend our Indonesia study group meeting next week. I have put the link in the chat box. Unfortunately, this will not be live online, but we will record and put it up on our YouTube channel a few weeks after the event. So before that's it from me. Thank you and see you in our next event. Bye.
Bye.
Aco,
Thanks, Lydia.
Thanks a lot, Mbak
Thanks.
Vina. Mudah-mudahan bisa ketemu.
Ya, mudah-mudahan Mbak Lydia. Terima kasih Pak Aco.
Thank you, Mbak Vina.
And also Prof. Lin, thank you. Thank you, Ros.
Thank you, Lin.
Bye.
Ros, Terry.
Aco.